staff report. We will begin with a presentation of the infrastructure problem. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, just jump right into it. Tonight we have Mr. Dennis Strait here to present to us. Dennis has been working really regionally, looking at and understanding our growth patterns here and also the impact that has on infrastructure, both issues, of course, that are near and dear to our hearts through our strategic plan. So tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Dennis Strait here to give the council some more information on these two relevant topics.
Thank you,
Hello.
Zach.
Hi, Dennis.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. First off, thank you for this opportunity to share this presentation. The planning studio at Gould Evans has been working with cities over the past few years to help them see their cities in a new way, and that's primarily what this presentation is about. It is focused on infrastructure, and it helps us understand some of the dynamics that we're trying to deal with now in cities as we look at this in a different way. This is a presentation that's focused on Kansas City, Missouri. We've shared it with the Mid-America Regional Council. We presented last week to city leaders over in Lawrence, Kansas. It has resonance to most communities because most of us are facing the same issues. So even though it's Kansas City centric, I hope you'll see some relevance for independence. So we start out with this crystal ball. I heard this morning that it looks more like a snow globe this time of year, so that wasn't the intent. But the idea is that for years here in the Midwest, we've been able to see development trends well before they come to us because we can just pay attention to what's going on the coast and we can see what's likely to be happening in our city soon. And that's been the case for as long as I've been practicing for the last 35 years. And that has relevance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So for people to understand some of the challenges facing cities, we decided just to focus on streets because that alone is a good illustration of some of the new challenges that we're facing. So this will primarily be a discussion about streets and about us adapting to new technologies. So I know a gentleman who was one of the safety engineers for General Motors back in the 60s when it was before we had safety belts, before we had lap or shoulder belts in particular. And he explained to me a phenomenon that always stayed with him, that if you can imagine going down the roadway with a passenger in your car and you're driving at 55 miles an hour and you see you're about to have a collision, your natural sympathetic inclination is to reach across and protect your passenger from falling into the dashboard, because it's a way of protecting your passenger. But it turns out to be the exact wrong thing to do. It turns out when a car is colliding with another object at that speed, for the first few moments, the car is absorbing most of that collision just in the physics of the situation. And if your forehead hits the dashboard at the same time the car is absorbing that collision, the car protects you. But if you stall somebody's forehead from hitting that dashboard at that moment, then after the car has taken most of the collision, if your forehead hits the dashboard, your forehead's going at 55 miles an hour, and it's actually a much worse outcome. So even though the human inclination is to help protect your passenger, it's an example about how a new technology has overcome our ability to adapt, right? Because we've not had cars for very long in our human history, but now we're adapting to that new technology. And the use of that new technology has created these unintended outcomes. So we'll talk about that as we go forward tonight. If you look at the way that cities have evolved throughout all types of cultures and all different parts of the world, they end up developing a pattern that's pretty familiar. In this illustration, it shows development patterns in Europe, in the Far East, in cities like New Orleans, and then you can see this pattern in cities as they evolved here in the Midwest. It was a form of placemaking that human beings have developed over thousands of years of learning how to build in ways that you can create human habitation and a sense of civic life. So it's a way that we've adapted through trial and error over, again, generations and generations of city building, much like other creatures have adapted their own environments that are unique to them. So that same form of city building is how Kansas City developed, starting back in the 1850s when we were just a village on the Missouri River. Within the first 80 years, we went from that small village to a full-fledged city. This is the late 1930s, just a city scene in downtown Kansas City, Missouri that shows a robust downtown with a whole variety of high-rise buildings, a very vivid and lively streetscape, and a streetcar back in the 1930s. It surprises people to see what we had, because today we're really working hard to try and recreate that sense of vitality in our downtown. If you back away from that a little bit, you see that we had an impressive city skyline even as early as the 1930s. And again, this is only 80 years after we started as a city from being a small village on the river. Kansas City's always had the unique benefit of having the Parks and Boulevard system as a way to think about our evolution and development, and it's given our city a special character. Most cities don't have that kind of design guideline to carry them forward in their city growth. We've always benefited from that. Most people in this area understand the value of our Parks and Boulevard system. What they don't remember, many of us don't remember because it's been gone too long now, is the extensive streetcar network we had by this same time in the late 1930s. You can see that network in red on this slide. We all know the challenge it was to create the streetcar we have today. It's about 4% of what this system was back in the day. And again, it was because we had developed a city based on very traditional and established patterns of city building by the 1930s. So throughout our history as a country, we've intentionally been driven to property ownership and home ownership. The Founding Fathers felt that a new nation based on the idea of independence would be more properly governed by a series of constituents who were property owners and had the independence of property owners. So everything from how Thomas Jefferson developed the metes and bounds system, which allowed for the country to be platted and sold off fairly quickly and fairly efficiently, that was motivated to help people become property owners. The Homestead Act, many of you probably had ancestors who acquired property through the Homestead Act, was a way of allowing people to acquire property and become property owners. The expansion of the railroad system throughout the 1800s made property much more accessible. All these things were helping make it so that we could all become those independent property owners. And that started to ramp up in the 1900s because even by then, with all these other efforts, most of us were not living in homes that we owned. Most of us still lived in rental housing. So in the mid-1900s, or actually in the early 1900s, the government started creating 30-year notes. Up and before that point, you had to have either a 5 or a 10-year balloon payment to purchase a home, and most people could not achieve that kind of down payment or payment schedule. So with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we started developing these 30-year mortgages in the 40s. There were programs that made them more affordable, and then we all came back from the wars and we started the baby boom, and we created a vast market that this country had never seen before. And then we facilitated that market with the National Highway System that made land accessible in ways that had never been before. So all those things were building up to start to change the way that we built cities, but it was one thing in particular that was the disruptive technology that changed the way that cities were built. And we all have these things now, but we didn't up until about 1950. By 1950, almost every family in the country had a car. Almost every family had the mobility of an automobile, which totally changed the way that we went about with city building. Prior to that time, cities were built at the scale of people. They were built at the scale of how close it was to walk to work or to walk to school or to walk to the grocery store and carry your groceries home. And when that distance became untenable, we built mass transit in the forms of streetcars and other types of transportation that got us around even further distances. And that explains how we built our city until about 1950, when that new form of technology came around and changed the game. Because now we weren't limited to how far it was away from home or from work to where you were trying to go, because you could drive 15 miles in a relatively short period of time. That change in the scale of city building is best reflected in this map of what happened in Kansas City over the last 175 years. If you look at the original, the little black square in the middle of this map is the village of Kansas City back in the 1850s. And within the first 100 years, we'd grown to a city of 80 square miles with 500,000 people living in it. Now, because of the expansion as a metro area, we continued to grow in population, and Kansas City, Missouri, continued to grow in land area, and by today, we now have 4 times as much land area. We have 320 square miles of land that's incorporated within the Kansas City, Missouri. But because of the metro area, most of that population growth has happened outside of Kansas City. So frankly, we're about the same size today that we were back in 1950. And what that means is that all of us are at least responsible for 4 times as much city as our ancestors back in the 50s were. It's actually a little more dramatic than that if you start measuring cities and the amount of infrastructure that we've had to build to keep up with this new form of city building. It's a dramatically different scale and responsibility of infrastructure than we ever had in the history of city building. So it was an unintended consequence that as we started taking advantage of this new form of mobility, that we would start building at a new scale that would cause us more liability in terms of infrastructure maintenance than we'd ever faced as a species, as a human civilization. So this map is a summary of that challenge for Kansas City, Missouri. Now, most cities didn't sprawl as much. Kansas City is known to being one of the most sprawled cities that you'll find in the country, but every city has grown since 1950, affected by this new technology. So if you look at the streets in Kansas City, Missouri, for example, there's 6,500 lane miles of street. That's enough street to start in New York City and pave a lane all the way to San Francisco and then turn around and pave a lane all the way back to New York City and then take a hike up to Montreal and come back down, and by that time you've paved Kansas City. So I like to tell people to think about that the next time it snows overnight and you're expecting your street to be plowed the next morning. It's a daunting amount of street to maintain. So if you look at the value of those streets, is just in present day dollars, we quickly can calculate that there's about $5 billion worth of street investment in Kansas City, Missouri. And then if you assume that streets last for 50 years, and depending on who you talk with, they'll say, well, maybe 25, but if you maintain them, 50 years is a reasonable number, then Kansas City, Missouri needs to be putting aside $100 million a year for replacement of those streets, because in 50 years, we'll have to build it all over again. Now, streets won't last that long unless we maintain them, and so these processes of mill and overlay that we see going on all around the city are necessary because just like a house, a street needs to have a good roof over it to protect it from having water get into the subsurface and deteriorate the subbase. That's what makes streets fail. So in addition to the replacement cost, you also have to be budgeting for the cost of maintenance. When you add these things together, you find that for Kansas City, Missouri, we need to be putting aside about $124 million a year to maintain our streets. This year, we've budgeted $16 million. This year was a slight increase on what we've done in previous years. Now, it's not because we didn't know that the problem was bigger than that. It's just because in the way that we budgeted everything in our city, it's what we could afford to set aside for street preservation. We also did something really cool in Kansas City in the last few years. We passed the $800 million GO bond, which was a commitment by the citizenry to invest in their infrastructure, which I was very proud of our city for doing that. So we have $800 million that we're reinvesting in our city over a 20-year period that is creating a $40 million fund each year, out of which we've been pulling $7 million for street preservation. So that's helping. And added to the annual maintenance budget, we now have $23 million to invest in street preservation, which is about a fifth of what we need to be putting aside to replace those 6,500 lane miles of streets. The same report that gave the city a budget for this year also recognized that in Kansas City, our streets, almost half of them have either failed or are in very poor condition. That starts to explain why we had all the hoopla about the potholes in one of our most signature streets along Ward Parkway. And I asked a group a few weeks ago how many people had lost a wheel to those potholes, and you'd be amazed how many people raised a hand in a group of about 100 people. It's just a sign of what's happening. And because the streets are in worse condition than if we just built them over the last 50 years, because they're older than just 50 years in many cases, the Public Works Department has identified that we need to be putting aside $166 million a year to get back on top of our streets to a point that they're in fair condition. Not a high bar, but at least a fair condition. That's 10 times more than we budgeted this year. So we can look at property taxes. A lot of people, you've heard throughout this year, I'm sure you've heard this too, about the reappraisals of property values, and we pay a lot in property taxes already. So shouldn't we be paying enough to take care of this problem? For Kansas City, Missouri, it's important to remember that of the property taxes you pay, only 20% actually goes to the city. It's probably similar here in Independence. And out of those property taxes that are collected, only about 2/3 of that is coming from real estate. So the things that are creating the need for infrastructure are providing about $100 million a year in Kansas City, Missouri. If you look at the proportion that the city gets out of that 20%, only about 40% of that is actually not committed. 60% of the money that goes to Kansas City, Missouri through property taxes is already committed to health systems and museums and debt payment. So we have about 40% left over, or about $40 million from our real estate property taxes that we could use for things like street maintenance, which again is about 1/4 of what we need. If we chose as a community to dedicate everything we could out of property taxes, it would still only be 1/4 of what we need. So our challenge is, and one way we try and describe this is that as a current generation, we've inherited a grand city from our ancestors. It's almost like we inherited a grand home from our ancestors. But we haven't been taking care of the roofs, and we haven't been taking care of the exterior of the building to protect the interior. We've made some investments along the way. We might have bought some new furniture and things, and we might have added some bedroom additions, but we haven't been taking care of the primary property, and we've been losing the value. And we're in danger of losing a substantial amount of value. So one other way of looking at this is to look at the post-1950s development pattern. Which is very familiar today with the way that we develop neighborhoods. If you take a typical neighborhood in a post-1950 development pattern and measure all the streets in that neighborhood, and then apply that on a per-home basis, we find that in this particular neighborhood, that home needs to maintain 136 linear feet of street so that you can get to it and from it. If you compare that back to how much we need to be setting aside, that's about $657 a year that home needs to be putting into the upkeep of our streets. And then if you look at how much the home's actually putting into it based on current taxation, and you use an example here of a $250,000 home and the valuation, and you factor it on down, that $250,000 home is actually achieving about $94 that could be applied towards street maintenance. So a $250,000 home, $94 is about 1/7 of what that home needs to be putting into it. Now we can look at a different development pattern, an urban development pattern. In this case, this is a mid-rise condominium building. Now because it's very compact, it only needs 52 linear feet of street because again, it's in an urban condition. So you have 14 units in this mid-rise building. That means each unit needs to generate $18 per unit to pay for the street infrastructure. If you assume it's the same $250,000 home value, then that unit is generating the same $94 a square foot because we don't tax based on development pattern, we just tax based on improvements. So then you compare that back to the post-1950 development model, and you find that it's 37 times more infrastructure burden for the post-1950s model than this urban model. And if you go through the math of what each is generating in terms of property taxes, you find that both are contributing the same to the city, but in one case, the city's finding an actual surplus. They're gaining more money than they need to take care of their infrastructure. But in the other case, they're finding a deficit, and a significant deficit. That's, again, 1/7 of what that community needs to maintain the homes that are in that post-1950s pattern. Now, one way that that we have been talking with cities about understanding this problem is to think about your city on a per acre basis, like a farmer would think about their farmland, and think about where you have really productive acres and where you have acres that aren't so productive. Any good farmer would know that they're going to pay a lot of attention to taking great care of those productive acres because that's what's bringing food home. And they're going to be careful about how they deal with investment in the less productive parts of their farm, or in our case, in our city. So if you look at the development pattern that way, the urban model is much more efficient than the post-1950s neighborhood model. And if you know, a lot of people will say, of course, you know, if we compare single-family subdivisions to urban areas, then there's going to be a difference there because one's much more compact and dense. So in this case, we'll talk about comparing subdivisions post-1950 and pre-1950, with the center line that you see between the two being the 1950 line. So on the left-hand side is a pre-1950 subdivision, and on the right-hand side is post-1950s. We talked about the one on the right. The one on the left, because it was built back before that disruptive technology became common, was still built in a fairly compact way because people were still trying to be close to amenities and resources. So even the way we used to build neighborhoods back in the 1950s and earlier was much more efficient than we're building them today. But they also had a secret weapon. Throughout our communities built before the 1950s, it was common to have multi-unit styles of residential buildings scattered throughout our neighborhoods. So we're all very familiar with these colonnade buildings that create a very efficient use of the farmland in terms of how productive they are. So you add that into the equation, and then our older way of building suburbs, our older way of building residential communities was 7 times more efficient than our newer way of building them. So you can play through the cost if we use the same $250,000 per unit model and find that, you know, again, that more efficient model is creating much more revenue for the city to use to maintain its community. What's surprising about this way of looking at the city is that we all know that the older parts of Kansas City, much of that is in the disinvested areas that are on the east side of Troost. And many of those homes aren't worth $250,000. In fact, they're only worth $50,000 on average. But if you use that price in this more efficient way of development, you can still find that on a per acre basis, which again is a much more reasonable way of measuring your investment in infrastructure, that those neighborhoods are actually as productive, if not more, than what we consider to be the affluent neighborhoods in our communities. It's a different way of understanding our city, and it helps us to understand how we might go forward, because this is an explanation of the infrastructure problem, not just in Kansas City, Missouri, but in the United States. It's all created by the same dynamic, and it's an issue that is starting to come home to roost because infrastructure is starting to fall apart faster than we can keep up with it. So we need to get into a position where we can start addressing that issue head on. In Kansas City, Missouri, at least, you can draw a pretty clear line between pre-1950 and post-1950 KC, and you can quickly understand where the productive parts of the city are, and it helps you understand that in many ways those productive areas have been subsidizing the way we've been developing for the past 75 years. So there are steps that we're recommending on how communities go forward. There are 3 different ways, 3 general ways that we're recommending that communities talk about how they could change the way that we've been doing city building for the last 75 years. So this first way is to respond to the fact that we've grown at an exponentially higher rate of development than we ever used to in our history. That was enabled again by this disruptive technology, and it's manifest in the size of the city we all need to take care of now. So the first step is to identify those areas that are costing you money and stop investing in those ways of city building. Much of the way, again, that we've been city building based on automobile scale growth has been not creating value for our cities, but actually creating liabilities. We can see that now, we can understand that now. And what we should do is to stop making things worse in that regard and find ways to not continue to invest in a development pattern that is causing us to go broke. Now, understanding your city this way also helps us to better understand how we should be thinking about resources like our revenue bonds. The GEO bonds for Kansas City was a great move. And it is generating that $7 million a year that we need to be reinvesting in our cities. At the same time, though, we're using at least $7 million a year, if not more in many cases, investing in new bridges, interchanges, and new roadways that are feeding that type of development that's actually long-term costing us money. So we're doing as much bad as we're doing good with the way we're using our $800 million. We have plenty of time to correct that because we're just into that program, but understanding how we've grown differently in the last 75 years can help us understand how we can turn the boat as we start going forward into the future. This issue about how do we maintain our city is not an easy one because when we look at city budgets and we look at how much we're actually dedicating to street preservation, just as one of the many things you all have to address with the management of any city, we could say, well, let's just increase the budget for city or street preservation, but that's not an easy thing to do, as you all know. Because then you have to pick, if you're going to increase that budget by 10 times to address your infrastructure issue, you're going to be not paying for something else that your community has prioritized as important. So you can't cut back on police, you can't cut back on health services. There's so many other things that you need to do that approach is not likely to be successful. If you go back to your property taxes and think about those as resources and think about how we could take a different approach to city building and to try and increase the pie rather than redistribute the pie by being intentional and strategic about the way we invest in ongoing growth of our cities. We can identify those development patterns that are generating value for us as opposed to the ones that are costing us in terms of long-term maintenance liabilities. So we can look back on some of our older forms of development to recognize there are ways that we can continue to grow and develop that will help us grow back out of the problems that we've generated. In Kansas City, Missouri, we just had a group complete a study of the city that looks kind of like this. There's a group that is helping communities around the country see their cities in new ways. This is a map of Lexington or Lafayette that shows their downtown area, which is pretty prototypical of any downtown area. This is showing the return on investment discussion about a city. If you look at those areas in black that are high spikes up, those are properties that are generating more value in tax revenue than they're requiring in infrastructure maintenance cost or public services. And if you look at everything else, you can see where the equation's upside down. It's easy for us now to do these kinds of maps. We're just now completing it for Kansas City, Missouri. At the same time, the Kauffman Foundation also funded Kansas City, Kansas to do the same thing. And Kansas City, Kansas in particular is starting to use this information to guide its development decisions and to help be much more strategic about where they make reinvestment in neighborhood redevelopment. So even the way that we built over the last 75 years can be made more efficient. If we learn from models of the past where we don't have neighborhoods that are stratified by just being single family, which was never a development pattern we had prior to 1950. That's a convention that we created with new zoning codes that created this different way of building that stratifies the value of a neighborhood because it freezes it at one level of development. Whereas our past neighborhood development patterns allowed for multifamily projects to be intermixed within those single family to make more value, create more return on investment, and allow those neighborhoods to be sustainable. So most people think about multifamily development in the old-fashioned way. There are plenty of ways today that we can build in our current neighborhoods in ways that completely fit in with the character and values of our neighborhoods that would allow those neighborhoods to be more productive and have a better chance of paying their way and be more contributing to the overall city's economy. So the last and probably most challenging thing we're talking about with communities is helping people understand that the way we've taxed ourselves has not helped because our tax programs don't motivate the kinds of behavior that create productive development patterns and ultimately create enough value to help us maintain our own cities. So if you look at the tax code and you remember that model I talked about where regardless of your development pattern, you pay whether you're in an efficient or an inefficient productive development pattern. We need to look at development and taxation and see if we can change the game. Right now, we primarily tax based on the cost of the improvement, the value of the improvement, as opposed to the value of the location. If you were taxing on the value of the location, you would take advantage of the infrastructure investment that the community's made in your property to develop it to an appropriate level. The fact that we don't have that explains why in the most valuable part of Kansas City, you'll find the least valuable kind of development. So in our downtown, you'll find far too many parking lots, which makes no sense economically. That's the lowest form of development we could put on those properties that are in the most invested portions of our city, where we could reap the highest and are reaping the highest value per acre of anywhere else throughout our community. But there's a motivation through our tax code that causes that to happen. If you're a speculator and you can keep your property tax low, then it can keep your holding costs low. So if you're taxed on the value of the improvements, you don't want to do any improvements. So parking is a pretty low improvement, doesn't create much value. So that encourages speculators to keep them poorly developed, which keeps money from flowing into our tax rolls and keeps our properties from being developed to their fullest potential. And it actually squanders the public investment in our city infrastructure. A similar phenomenon happens on the outskirts of our downtown areas and our central city neighborhoods. In many cases, property investors recognize that you can buy dilapidated homes and just let them continue to fall apart, because then your taxes will be incredibly low, and again, you can hold those for a long period of time, hoping that the neighborhood will come back and then you'll reap a windfall. We all know what that does. It starts the pattern of disinvestment that we're fighting now in too many parts of our city. So we leave this one for last because this one is a statewide discussion. We can't just choose as a community to change our tax code, but we can recognize that our tax code isn't helping us motivate the kind of behaviors that we all would want to motivate if we're trying to grow a healthy and productive city. So back to the crystal ball that's not intended to be a snow globe. One of the things that our chamber does for the last 30 or so years now is we visit other cities every year to understand how they're doing and look for ways to learn from their accomplishments. The mayor has gone on a number of those trips, and they're very valuable in my mind. 4 years ago, we went to Portland, Oregon, which is one of the coolest, hippest, most walkable communities you'll find. And one of the things we took away from that is that Portland is going to have and they're going to continue to have a real struggle with affordable housing. Coming back from that trip, I recognized that this community doesn't have that same problem because we still have very affordable property. So we are in a position where we can avoid Portland's problem if we're thoughtful about how we move forward with reinvestment. The same group went to Nashville this last about 2 months ago, and we made an intentional point to talk with that city about what they wish they would have done different, because they're already down the path that Portland and other top grade cities are finding themselves, where they've had development success and now they have inequity and they have reinvestment problems for all of their community. And what was most gratifying to me was that we spent a lot of our time as a group of 150 civic leaders talking about issues like affordable housing and shared prosperity at a time where we're starting to recognize how to get back on top of our infrastructure problem. So we are all in a position where we can be much more thoughtful about how we can go forward and address those issues of shared prosperity and inequities and affordable housing, because we can afford it still. That's not going to last. If you look at Kansas City, Missouri, I'm sure you've had the same phenomenon here. For the last 10 years, there's been an incredible amount of multifamily development. If you look at who's doing that development, it's almost all outside developers who have come to Kansas City and done their development projects in our city because they recognize the value that we are. We have developers that are coming to Kansas City because Colorado Springs is no longer profitable for them. And that's happening throughout the country. And it's happening beyond multifamily development. Other people are recognizing the value in our community better than we are. And we're going to miss an opportunity, this opportunity we have in front of us, of recognizing where we presently are as a community in our development, our redevelopment. We can take advantage of that while we can still afford it if we recognize the problem. We have a beautiful city. It's easy to sell Kansas City these days because of that photo behind me and because of all the amenity we've built. But we do have an infrastructure challenge that we need to get on top of, or we're going to hamstring ourselves and not be able to afford to do the things that we want to do as a community going forward. So I hope this has been helpful. I'd love to take any questions that you have. We're really working hard to help communities understand that we need to start looking differently about how we grow our cities. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. That was a very interesting presentation. I would say that everything's kind of a matter of scale. That's the same story as Independence, and probably our development is accelerated even greater than Kansas City, where in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, our city looked far different than it does today, that it was primarily centered around the square in Western Independence and then kind of grew out in concentric circles. So I think it is very applicable. And I particularly was interested in your streetcar map and the connectivity north, south, east, and west, that streetcar and those people who are old enough to remember that streetcar system, how they could get anywhere from Independence to Kansas City to north on that streetcar system. So when we're looking at this, and I think you made an excellent point that in the cities that we've visited with the Kansas City Chamber and just with our own city leadership, different places, is we're really at a critical point in our region to be able to control that kind of growth, enjoy that prosperity, but doing it in a way to avoid some of the problems that other cities have experienced. But I do think that connecting is a key component of that, that we can't just look at Kansas City or Independence or Gladstone or you name it, Prairie Village, and look at them in isolation, but how to connect that whole region. We do not have general obligation bond in Independence, so we do not have a dedicated funding source for these infrastructure improvements, but we know that we have deteriorating infrastructure and places in the city where the infrastructure was not built and will need to be built for development to happen. So very interesting presentation. Are there comments or questions?
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Yeah, it was very interesting going through the material reading here. I was able to plug in some spots where I thought some highlights of Independence, specifically my district, might get plugged in, and some more glamorous than other. But I could completely see where the absentee landlords are encouraged to allow low-value properties and deterioration, bring down all the other properties and stuff like that. And that's something that we're beginning to take a look at. Fairmont jumped right out of me, the heart of the business district. Had a meeting with Friday to talk about these instances that are taking place there and how we can strategize with our executive team to put a halt to that as development, and working with conjunction with MoDOT to do some infrastructure improvements there. On so what do we do now? Your first subset, second part of it, invest strategically in areas of the city where development, and I would say redevelopment, can occur. And I'm thinking Inglewood, where we're doing some really good stuff there, laying down the groundwork, the foundation to really attract and do those things that you're targeting. So good, interesting history lesson. There's Kansas City, and I can see where some of this could be pointed right to Independence. So thank you.
Thank you. So one of the clues is to look at your pre-1950 city, because most cities are like this. They still built at an intensity that creates a lot of value if you reinvest in those areas.
Sure.
Yep. Very much. Okay. Yes.
So, yeah, thank you for your presentation. It seems like this is just the tip of the iceberg talking about the roads, because when you look at the infrastructure and you look at the water system, the sewer system, all the other infrastructure of the city, it puts Kansas City, as well as most cities, behind the 8 ball as far as being able to keep up and maintain that infrastructure, some of which is probably over 100 years old. It seems to me that most laws are there to teach as well as to guide decisions. And it's very difficult to enact laws that are not self-serving for either the state government or local governments. And so the encouragement by tax law, which, by the way, I think is going to be very difficult to change in this state or most states, is one of those things that has been set up to be pretty much self-serving for most communities, most states, because they have certain things that they have to maintain, and it's very difficult to change. So one of the things that really needs to be discussed is priorities. It seems that there really is no good forum for overall discussions on priorities, either at the state level or the city level. Yes, we have priorities, we have our strategic plan and that sort of thing. But until we actually put that in place and talk about one thing at a time and move toward that one thing, it's going to be very difficult for us to change. Our community luckily has seen the start of at least one development that is kind of a throwback to the 1950s and before, and that's the New Harmony development, which is a mixed development of many different cost structure housing. So it's multi-housing, it's small housing, large housing, estate housing, and walkable. It's a walkable scenario, walkable community development. It's just starting, but it's the same thing that has happened over in St. Charles. Some of us got the opportunity to tour that. So that's an interesting change for our community and for maybe the future, where we could actually save on some of that infrastructure and actually change a little bit of society's values in that direction. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's encouraging.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you, and thank you all for your time. Appreciate that.
Thanks. Next, we have our 2020 state legislative policy. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, I ask John Mayfield, our Community Liaison Specialist, to come up and give you an overview of our proposed 2020 state legislative policy with the intention that this would appear on the council agenda at the upcoming meeting for formal adoption. Mr. Mayfield.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Mayor Weir, members of the City Council, good evening. John Mayfield, City Manager's Office. Tonight, I am with you to share the proposed 2020 state legislative policy with you for the City of Independence. Mayor Weir, the City Manager's Office, civic leaders, staff, and our lobbying teams have played a role in shaping the document before you. These are the priorities we believe we should proactively advocate for on behalf of the city. And this policy contains general statements in several areas to kind of guide our lobbying teams as legislation comes forward in the 2020 legislative session so that they can respond appropriately. I'm briefly just going to list these and just generally talk about them. One, support legislation to reinstate the authority of municipal governments to suspend in-state driver's licenses for failure to appear or failure to pay fines for traffic violations. Number two, I realize this is a little wordy, so I'll try to get through that for you. I know there's a riveting Rams-Ravens game coming on here in a little while. Oppose efforts to cap local sales taxes or to take away the ability for the city to ask the voters of Independence to decide the local sales tax rate. Third, support efforts to keep the Steamboat Arabian Museum in the state of Missouri. Number four, oppose any reductions in the cable franchise fee. And fifth, support local control of rights of way and public assets. Local governments need the authority to set reasonable and predictable application processes and fees for deployment of wireless facilities, including small cell pole attachments. I'm gonna kind of go through these briefly, and then if you have comments, that's fine. If you want to wait till the end, that's fine too. Failure to appear in municipal court has become a very serious problem for municipalities all across the state. And we see this as a very serious public safety concern. The City of Independence has 99 miles of highway to patrol, including multiple federal and state routes. Since the passage of municipal court reform in 2014 and 15, there's been a serious decline in compliance. A 2018 editorial in a local paper was entitled, "There's no punishment for not showing up to court, how Missouri defendants get off easy." And it listed an example from our municipal court where one day there was a dock of about 380 cases and about 8 people showed up. That's definitely a problem. We have about 15,000 cases a year typically of people not showing up to address their traffic violations, and that's kind of scary if you think about that. Secondly, we oppose any caps on local sales taxes. We believe that the voters in every community are the best judges of what they wish to pay to fund their local communities. There were several related sales tax bills that were filed last year that did a lot of goofy things, would have, if enacted, would have done a lot of goofy things to the sales tax rate. For example, one bill would have raised the sales tax rate by 2% for the state, but kept the overall sales tax rate. So basically, we get ours, but you don't get yours, basically, kind of a mentality. So we need to be on the lookout for that. Many of you are familiar with the Steamboat Arabia Museum in Kansas City, owned by a local family. It's in the River Market area. The lease expires in 2026, but there's a lot of different reasons why the owner and I think Kansas City are kind of in agreement. Maybe he should look for another location. I don't know that he's entirely happy there because the artifacts are very need to be very well protected, and with the economic growth and different kinds of utility lines and water lines and so forth, the artifacts could get damaged. And so he has been looking for a new home. Communities across the state of Missouri and also communities outside of Missouri are interested in bringing this attraction to their community, including but not limited to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's our hope that we can work with the state and other local cities to at least come to an agreement that this artifact that was sunk in the Missouri River in 1856 and owned by a local family should, at the very least, stay in the state of Missouri. Fourth,
Yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, break your flow there, John. Question for you, perhaps the city manager, any possibilities of any more discussions with them to attract them here?
The conversations aren't daily, but they're ongoing. They're very well of our interest here in Independence, and certainly continue to keep those lines of conversation open.
Any interest on the state level for possible help funding sources that can bring?
The legislation that was filed last year was not favorable to Independence. It would have been more favorable to locating this in Jefferson City.
Right. Future, should we maybe look down that avenue?
I would say so.
How do we put that on the agenda for that?
Pardon me, this will be on the council agenda next week for adoption, so we could look to modify that at that time to make it more Independence specifically. I'm really redundant.
Sure. Thank you.
we oppose any reduction in the cable franchise fee rate. Over the last several years, there's been an effort to try to cut it from 5% to 3%. A 1% cut would be $270,000 in lost revenue for the city of Independence. So that would be overall a loss of $540,000 in revenue. And it's my understanding that there are talks ongoing currently with some folks in Jefferson City about bringing that legislation forward again. And it has a little steam, so we need to be watching that bill very closely. And finally, local control over public assets. In 2018, legislation was passed as basically, in essence, a 2-year truce between local governments, utilities, and cell phone or small cell technology providers. And it did give us local control over our utility poles as far as attachments are concerned. And it became effective January 1st of this year, and it expires January 1st, 2021, with the legislature convening or ending on May 15th. We have to have a solution or something to that regard to protect our ability to control utility pole attachments. There's some other things that we're going to be watching for. I'll get into those just very briefly. Historic tax credits, film tax credits, and local and low-income housing tax credits. We feel these are very important for economic development, historic preservation, and affordable housing. Over the summer, the Missouri State Senate formed a committee, the Tax Credit Efficiency Reform Committee, to review tax credits, and we are all for transparency. We're all for being in support of things that work, and I know that there are a lot of senators that are very supportive of some of these tax credits, and some may be not as high on others, but we are watching out for these. Our community has had some good examples of using these appropriately. Mount Washington Senior Apartments is an example. It was an old school owned by Kansas City School District that was acquired by Independence School District in 2007. I was on a committee appointed by Dr. Henson. I actually toured that facility. I wouldn't want my worst enemy to live or go to school in that facility. And it was rehabbed with the use of tax credits. And today there are 45 senior citizens living there, and it's a productive facility. And it was a historic building that could have just been, completely demolished and forgotten about, be a vacant lot, not helping anybody. And so tax credits are very helpful. Finally, I wanted to talk about the film tax credits. I know this is a favorite topic of the Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Van Camp. On March 4th of this year, he traveled with me to Jefferson City to testify in support of House Bill 923, which would provide tax credits for qualified film and TV projects. 38 states and the city of Kansas City have some type of film tax credit. And we've lost out on projects such as the filming of some episodes of the HBO series Sharp Objects with Amy Adams, I always like to say one of my favorite actresses. And why this is important is that a TV series can spend anywhere between $7,500 to $300,000 a day in a community when you think about the food, catering, event space, security, equipment, lodging, and on and on. And that is a big tax boon for a community. The state of Georgia has a very attractive one, and they are just cleaning up. They are getting a lot of projects that maybe would be better suited for Missouri or for Independence even. We have a list of facilities and locations that people love. People reached out to Eric Erfer, our Director of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. But then when they get a phone call from somebody in Georgia or North Carolina, a lot of projects end up going there, including the series Ozarks, 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri. Went out of state. They would have loved to have filmed here, but other places had better opportunities for them. The bill was passed out of all of the appropriate committees. Thank you for your help, Council Member. Appreciate that. But unfortunately, it did not receive a vote on the House floor. Councilmember Doherty probably remembers those days well. But this bill got more traction this past year than it has in many years. It expired in 2013, and we're hopeful maybe it'll get some more traction next year. So that is what we're watching for. This concludes my my presentation. Again, I know you have a riveting Rams-Ravens game you probably want to go home and watch. So I'm available for any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Are there comments or questions on our proposed legislative policy?
Madam Mayor, Mr. Mayfield, the top 5 that you just went through, like number 3, which is the Steamboat Arabia, is number 18 on the list of attachments. So how do we decide what's 1, what's 2, what's 3, what's 4, what's 5? I'm so confused.
I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to, Council Member. I'd be happy to sit down and discuss that.
Well,
with
number
you.
3, the city supports efforts
Yeah,
to
that's
keep the
under
Steamboat Arabia
yeah,
in
under
Missouri.
Under top 5, okay.
Yeah, and it's number 18. It's on page 7 of 8. And like when we give our lobbyists our list of priorities, do they get the whole list, or they just get this sheet of paper?
They have what I have in front of me. That is different than what you have apparently,
So
Councilmember.
maybe I can answer that. We meet with our lobbyists. John and I have gone to Jefferson City to meet with our lobbyists and discuss with them some things that we want to keep an eye on. It's largely decided by what the legislature brings forward. If we have something in particular that we are wanting to be proactive on, such as things regarding court reform, then our lobbyists help us to identify members of the legislature who may be willing to sponsor that legislation, and they may be our local representatives, or they may be somebody outside of our local representation, depending upon what it is. Primarily, we have a few things that are top priorities that we're primarily watching. I don't know that we necessarily have sought, well, we have. I mean, we sought a sponsor for a bill to be able to allow us to do the tourism tax, give us that authority. We saw assistance in having the state convey the National Frontiers Trails Museum to us. But primarily, we work with our lobbyists, both for the city and our utilities, to say, what do you see on the, I mean, they're the ones who are there throughout the year, and say, what do you see on the horizon that we should be looking for in terms of opportunity, and also in terms of things that we think that we should be guarding against happening to us that may be detrimental to our city. So there really isn't a list of, a ranked list of 1 through whatever. It's really more to, well, we have to put them on a list, but.
It says in priority order. It says
I'm-
in priority
okay.
order.
I'm not sure exactly, but I'll be happy to sit down with you and go over that with
Okay,
council
I'd
members if you'd
appreciate
like.
that, because I like the Steamboat Arabia, but I think statewide prescription drug monitoring is a little bit more important than the Steamboat Arabia, at least for the city of Independence. And this is our priorities, the city of Independence priorities for the Barget firm, I would think, not for
Yes.
IPL. Are we going to get a separate IPL list of priorities?
Well, number 4 and 5 apply to the utilities council member.
Oh, this is for both our lobbying groups? Okay.
Yes. Again, I'd be happy to sit down with you and go over that with you and clear up any
Okay, thank you.
misconceptions that I may have given. I apologize for that.
Okay, no problem.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to comment on a couple of these. The longer list, I guess, will be used by our lobbyists as well to go to
Yes, it's provided to both our
legislators.
lobbying teams, that is correct, yeah.
So, I mean, the 2 that I was looking at were the crisis intervention teams, obviously for the police department, and obviously we have some grant money that we're gonna be using for that, because it is a priority, as well as the increased funding for mental health services. I know that we've talked regionally about the huge need for a crisis center in eastern Jackson County, and the lack of crisis centers in the entire Jackson County. And it seems to me that that should be a really top priority. Unfortunately, most of the folks that are in crisis wind up in jail, which is not really a mental health facility. So I'm glad to see that in there, and I would like to ask maybe that we in some way put that on our website, our legislative priorities on the website, so that not only legislators and people in Jeff City can see what our priorities are, but maybe the public can give input on some of those too, and tweak those for next year. So, thanks.
Yes.
It's been my experience that we pay these people to look at the things as they come up down there. And if something is tried to be, for lack of a better word, slid in, they are the people who have the expertise to address that. And so it means that they're no particular order of priority. As they emerge, they will be handled, and keep their ear to the floor, as Mr. Doherty would know, or Councilman Doherty, and be aware of the situation. And it was over $1 billion in Georgia.
And they said it created 41,000 manufacturing jobs because of that film tax credit.
Right, and so I think that, I don't know that we, as a city, could create a tax incentive of our own,
I think there's only one city I'm aware of that does that, so,
and that is,
Kansas City.
right, and they've had phenomenal success with it. Whether they, I think it's something that I tried to look into, and maybe we should, on our own level, start to look at something like that, because it, although it's gaining ground down there, it's not overflowing.
That's correct.
I don't know, it's a win-win situation. When Gone Girl, when we had the tax incentive in Missouri before it sunset, garnered a phenomenal amount of money, and it's always been shown there when we have these hearings. I don't understand the drawback, but we'll keep doing the great fight. But I think maybe there might be something on a local level.
Something worth pursuing.
Thank you.
Anything?
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
if I can keep the conversation going, to bring it back around on the Steamboat Arabia. And I'm not trying to kick a dead horse unless I really have to. But I mean, that's quite an important piece of history and also quite a historical attraction. I mean, you're talking about the turn of 80,000 people. You're looking at another Truman Library is what you're looking at. And perhaps this is not the legislative year to do it, but I would strongly suggest, and we can talk more, Mr. City Manager and colleagues, that we should perhaps approach our legislative team down there in Jeff City to see what type of incentives, if we can attract something, because 2026 is going to be right around the darn corner. And I'd like to think if we can have some positivity there to try to bring that, so we can have 2 tourist attractions that's equivalent to, Truman Library. That would really be a benefit to the city and to our local economy. I think that's a futuristic direction that we need to look at. And if we don't, I think we're just fooling ourselves.
Madam Mayor, I suggest if we're going to try and get the Steamboat Arabia in town, that we change the legislative priority to say that. This says that we support efforts to keep it in the state of Missouri. Why should we spend our tax dollars to keep something in the state of Missouri?
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
just to reiterate myself, I think it's something they're looking to go out of state of. I think 2, I don't think we'll have to put that much legwork into. Perhaps we do. I don't know. I've never been down there. Number 3, I think perhaps not this time, but trying to think ahead, and perhaps you can think with me, Councilwoman, that if by some chance in 2026, 2027, we have the ability to bring that type of tourism here, that would be an economic boom for our city and for our residents. And also, if you remember what the gentleman was saying, talking about our tax revenue and how we can help support our infrastructure, that would be a boom. You got to have the vision. You got to be able to look ahead, and that's where I think perhaps we don't need to do it this year to tie it into our legislative agenda, but most certainly start laying the groundwork for that.
Just to give some background on the legislation that was proposed last year, it was to add a additional fee to casino, the gate at the casino, and to raise the money to put the Steamboat Arabia in Jefferson City, Missouri, which would eliminate so that would be a statewide fee on every casino to benefit one city. So that did not gain any traction. This was intended to say, let's first try to prevent the Steamboat Arabia from leaving the state of Missouri. If there is going to be statewide legislation, let it be to keep the Steamboat Arabia, to provide some funding to keep the steamboat in the state, and then let the various cities compete for where that may be located. It's the owners of the collection and the museum are now, I understand, undergoing a appraisal of their collection. So it's not just about a location, it's about the acquisition of the entire collection, which is estimated to be upwards of $50 million. So what we have been discussing in the many times that we have been to Jefferson City is to assist the legislature and the lieutenant governor, who is now oversees tourism, to come up with a funding source for this to be a statewide asset, and then that would allow the cities in the state to potentially compete for locating the actual collection and future collections, as there's many more steamboats that the family has identified that they would like to excavate and put on display. So this is an attempt to say, let's not let this go to Las Vegas or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Illinois, but let's see if there can be a statewide funding mechanism to keep it in the state. And then that would allow independents and other cities in the state to compete for providing a location for this collection. So that is what we are discussing have been discussing potentially with the lieutenant governor, is there a statewide funding that would keep that here and then allow the cities to make proposals about where that might be located? Anything else? Okay, thank you. This brings us to our boards and commission report. Madam City Clerk?
We have a few boards and commissions that staff is looking for recommendation to add a resolution to the next regular agenda. First is Tourism Commission. We're looking to reappoint Russell Cannon. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution to the next meeting.
Is there any objection from the council? Hearing none, we'll add that to the next meeting.
The next commission is the Japanese Sister City Committee. We're looking to appoint Maju Hanaoka to the Japanese Sister City Committee. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, we'll add that to the next council meeting.
Next is Jackson County Animal Welfare Committee. We're looking to add a resolution to reappoint Jack Cardwell and Tim Watkins. If there's no objection, we'll add a resolution.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, add that to the next council meeting.
And then we also have Stormwater Control Oversight Committee. We're looking to reappoint R. Scott Smith. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, add that resolution.
Thank
Madam City Clerk, would you also like to present to us your recommendations for board and commission reductions in membership?
Yes, so staff is looking to reduce membership in 2 boards and commissions. The first is the Board of Building and Engineering Appeals. Currently, there's 2 alternate positions that are vacant. If there's no objection, we'll add a resolution, or excuse me, we'll add an ordinance to remove those 2 alternate positions at the next regular meeting.
Is there any objection? Okay, please prepare that ordinance.
And then finally, we're looking to remove 3 positions from the Industrial Development Authority. Currently, we have 3 expired terms. The incumbents aren't looking for reappointment, so we're looking to remove those positions. By state law, we only have to have 5 positions on that development authority, so we're just looking to reduce the number of positions. If there's no objection, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Is there any objection? Okay, please add the resolution.
Thank you.
Mr. City Manager, anything else this evening?
Nothing tonight.
We are adjourned.